Good evening and welcome to our monthly live threaded Q&A. My name is Adrienne Garrison and I'll be your host for the evening. Threaded is an organization that helps people like you effectively bring the love of Christ to racial conflict and conversations. We know that the racial conversation is a minefield, and so we created this space to help talk through some of the questions and concerns you have. Joining me for our February live Q&A are Marcus Lloyd and Anton Malone. How are you guys doing tonight?
Hey, Adrienne, feeling good. Feeling good. It's a beautiful day down here, or it was a beautiful day down here in the Dallas, Texas area. We started really nice. I think the high was like 68 or something like that, and then the rain came. So we're a little wet, but still feeling pretty good. I don't know. What are you feeling over there, Antoine?
I'm feeling good. It wasn't right. It was a sunny day, and then it wasn't. So, but
it was gone like that.
Such is life. Such is life.
Yes, and I left my sunroof. I left it. You know how you can kind of
do
it up. I didn't leave it open, but I just kind of had it popped up because the weather.
You had a little something in the car waiting for you.
I got in there. Yeah, I got in there, and it was immediately like there. And I had to kind of just go for it. So
there it is.
We got Doug in the house. What's happening, Doug?
Douglas, what's up, man?
What's happening? Okay.
Oh, you know what? We are not. The Facebook isn't live with us today, so I think we just rocking our YouTube audience today.
Okay. Well, all right. Is that on purpose? Is that on purpose?
You know what?
When I get rid of Facebook, we just done
when we schedule this, Facebook continues to frustrate.
Yes.
Because Facebook's thing now is it won't let you schedule their platform after 7 days. So I created this whole thing more than 7 days ago.
Okay.
To sort of be able to talk about it and Facebook was like, nah, you got to do it within 7 days. And so I was like okay,
the window is 7 days.
Yeah. Like I have to do it within 7 days. So the event itself is 8 days or more away, and then they won't let you create it for Facebook, which is very frustrating. And so I didn't come back and recreate it. So.
That's all right. We're rocking here on YouTube. We got folks in the house.
What's up, man? This is where we want to be anyway. Like I actually don't want to be on Facebook. Like
that's what Doug is saying. And Brian's here. Good to see you, Brian.
Brian's in the house.
I'm glad that you guys are not completely traumatized by weather. I think you're only 1 year out from the big, power outage thing you had.
Yeah.
As they say down here, the Arctic blast. Everything's an Arctic blast, and my brother and sister and I, we just
that was an Arctic blast that we had last year for sure. We had a minimal one this year, and then I think my sons came in from school today like, Dad, next Thursday is a 20% chance of snow, and I was like, my boy, it's not.
And the prayers of the children were answered. I feel like if we would just ask our children to pray, maybe the world would be a better place, because snow happened after the prayers of many children around DFW.
Yes,
last week or whenever that was, that we had a little bit of snow. It all went down.
Yes.
Well, hey, so I see numbers up, but I only see a couple people. So if you are joining us, then feel free to say hello in the chat. This is an unscripted night, so we do not have any scripts. We're just going to talk about what we talk about, mostly your questions and thoughts, things that you are bringing to the table. So we are. It's going to be an awkward time if you don't give us stuff to talk about. So.
That's right. So that's the call then, right? If you're sitting in there, the people who are watching, anything that you want to put into the what's up, Chris? Good to see you. Anything you want to put into the chat, just to kind of ask questions, maybe something that happened this week, maybe something from the news.
It is Black History Month, so there's
Black History Month. You
Black
can
History Month.
Ask questions about Black history.
We got a question about Black History Month. We got a couple of questions ahead of time, but we would love to see any questions, feedback, comments.
Jump in and let's get a question going, and then
let's do it.
Yes, and Brian is correct. It's always unscripted. here.
Indeed.
Oh, Doug wants an update on how many threaded groups are starting this month.
Oh, that's a
Ooh,
great.
Let's
I
start
need
with
an
good
update.
news. Let's
I'm
do
telling
this.
you, Doug, that's a great question.
It's
I
a
have
great
not
question.
asked for an update. We usually meet Friday mornings.
I can tell
And
you.
but Antoine can tell you, I guess.
I can tell you. There are 3 groups online that are meeting, virtual groups. And it's funny because they're kind of like on both coasts of East Coast and West Coast. There's like some in Oregon and some in on the, let's see, is it who's over there? Who's over there?
That's Doug is over
Is that
there.
New York? Or is it
No,
Doug?
he's talking
Doug
about
with
New
Ohio?
York. New York. We got New York. We got Ohio, and we've got Portland.
Portland. That's what I'm
Yeah.
thinking about.
Yeah.
New York. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And then we've got some more things happening in Ohio that we don't have record of, but we know groups are happening. And some other places that groups are happening, but they're not say our groups, if you will. Like they're people who are picking up our material and just doing it. So
yeah, absolutely. Zach, good question.
Very nice.
I see Doug also has the question in there. Reading Roadmap to Reconciliation 2.0. Any thoughts on that? That is by the illustrious Dr. Brenda Salter McNeil, soon to be my mentor here in the next week. So I'm a big fan. And Doug, you said you're out in Oregon. So actually, Dr. Brenda is out in that area. She's at Seattle Pacific University out there. One of the pioneers of this conversation of the current modality of the conversation of racial reconciliation. Some really good things in that book that helps towards some of the things that she does even for consulting. So highly recommend it. There's 2 books. There's the Racial Reconciliation Part 1. This is kind of the first one, but she's got Part 2, which adds to the end Restoration, which wasn't in the original book. So yeah, highly recommend that. So I'm sorry, Adrian, I'm just looking at questions and going for it. So
nothing to apologize for. That's what we're going to do. We're going to get to all of this here tonight. But let's kick things off. And Brian wants to know if there are any in-person groups in Fort Worth, Arlington area. So let's make sure.
No, we don't have any. We found that most people are doing the virtual still, partially because they're getting the people who are signing up are kind of from all over the country. And so to be able to do virtual allows you, like we're doing now, to have that connection. And I know people are like, virtual. I've done probably 4 groups virtually. And it's really been good. I think, you do miss out on the immediate connection and being able to follow up and maybe do some of the experiences that we do together. But as far as the team really connecting, people have connected and they've connected in different states. They've been like, hey, I'm going to be in San Diego. You're going to be in San Diego. And so they get together and hang out. So it definitely is not, we're losing a little bit, but not too much on that.
I love that you guys are doing that. That's excellent. I mean, so many of us have felt alone in this journey, and you got to plant those seeds, and then the people that have been able to enjoy like the virtual groups can plant something in their home church. So that's really awesome.
And just to continue, I mean, we trained over 30 people for facilitators over the last couple of months.
So
we've had several before. So we've almost got 50.
We got more facilitators than we have people interested at the moment.
So it's just about getting it out there. So we've got facilitators. There's some who couldn't do spring and some are going to do summer and fall. They'll spread it out. But that's been a big thing, is just people would be interested, and then we'd have to figure out facilitators. But we've got some great facilitators coming through. So we'll keep adding. We have another facilitator training that is virtual. And it will be in April. I think it's like April 28th. Stay tuned or subscribe to the newsletter so that you can continue to get that information. But that's another time we can do facilitators so people can do groups in their own spaces. So Brian, to your point, there can be people in Arlington who start a group where they are or whatever, which is kind of what's happening in other parts of the country as well. So
awesome. Well, let's kick things off with current events, and then we'll jump over to Carissa's question, because that is perfect, honestly, with some of the conversation we were having before we even went live. So first off, we're going to talk about Whoopi and her latest statements. Break it down for us. What was wrong with what she said?
With what? Wait a minute, one more time.
Yeah.
The question is, I was curious, what do you guys thought about the Whoopi Goldberg situation? I don't know if I understand why what she said was wrong.
Yes.
So are you familiar enough with that, Marcus?
I am. Yeah. I mean, you can open it up if you want, just because I've been talking a little bit. So if you want to.
Oh, well, no. So Whoopi Goldberg on The View made some comments about the Holocaust, just to bring everybody up to speed, you know. And one of the things she said was that the Holocaust was not about race. And she went on with some other sentences after that. but that was the sentence that got her into some trouble, and she was suspended from the show, so forth and so on. And so I can't remember what it was she said after that.
She said it wasn't about race, but it's about man's inhumanity toward man. And then so she did that. She got hit up, everybody went after her. She apologized, sort of, and then went on kind of the show and then on like Colbert, I think that same night, and kind of doubled down on the things that she had said. And that's when she got suspended for 2 weeks from the show. So everybody's kind of talking about, this context with the Jewish community and this construct of race. So I know I interrupted you, Antoine, so I didn't know if you wanted to.
Well, I'll just say what I thought about what she said. So I didn't have a problem with what she said because I think what she was trying to do was get to what's behind race. So like, racism, if we're stacking dominoes, racism might be the third domino of a series of thought patterns. And so I think what she was trying to do was to say it was racism, but it's really about humans not seeing other humans well in general, which is, and I think she was trying to deconstruct, if you will, racism in a way. And I think people just were traumatized in a sense by hearing that. And so I don't have a problem with talking about the thing behind the thing, which is, if we're talking about racism, then there's a thing behind racism that enables racism, that fuels racism. And I think that's what she was trying to do. She may not have obviously didn't do it effectively. But that's the way that I see that. I think she did come back and say it was about race. I should have said it's both racism and whatever else she said, which is probably the right move. But we live in a unsophisticated time, I think, and unfortunately people just seem to grab on to the simplest version of what you're saying, and then that's it, and that's an unfortunate reality. That's my 2 cents about that.
I think what she got caught in is, it's to your point, is that many people don't have a sophisticated understanding of even race and the way it morphs, as far as what it's kind of a moving target at times, and sometimes, and it exists differently in different eras and times, right? So like today, when we talk about race, like in 2022, if we talk about it, many times it is strictly a skin color type of thing, right? Because of the homogenation, if you will, that whiteness kind of did based on skin color. The Jewish community kind of got brought into that. They kind of got homogenized into whiteness at some point along the way, even though they continue to be a group that people are against, that keep people maneuver against in different ways. And it's not just, it's not just it's not just a religious idea, because there are lots of people who are Jewish who don't consider themselves to be religious, don't believe in God, but they culturally are connected to Judaism from a blood standpoint. So historically, when the Holocaust was happening, they were considered, in that particular space, Germany, Nazi Germany, they were considered a racial group that was different from the sort of Aryan, what we would call white society. That was the whole point. It's like they were trying to create this beautiful white society, this perfect white society, and the Jewish culture is the antithesis of that. They're not real, they're below us, whatever, and so they can be destroyed and moved out of the way. And it wasn't just Jewish people; they were doing it to other groups as well, Polish people, lesbians, gay. Like there were lots of things, but the Jewish conversation is what we're having right now. So I think Whoopi's conversation, I think with her comment, just because it exists in today, she's walking it through from this context of today, and was not able to give sort of credence to the other sort of historical aspects of which race is located. And so I think that's what kind of did her. So that's what was quote unquote wrong. And again, this is a society that loves to kind of go after people. There's conversation where people are even kind of going, isn't it interesting how strongly they went after this Black woman, right? People are bringing in some of that stuff as well. So what was interesting is how I think the media kind of dealt with it. Whoopi she's a very controversial character, sort of even historically, in the midst of race conversations. I think when she was dating or married to Ted Danson, they went to a party in blackface, both of them. That's been decades now, I think. So she's already had these conversations, these controversial things. But it's so interesting how she's viewed in the space. She's very liberal, you would say. And Sean Hannity was protecting her on Fox News. I saw a whole thing where he was like, "I know Whoopi, she's great," and whatever. And some of the other like hosts on that show were like, "Yeah, but it's good to see somebody liberal getting hit the same way we do," that kind of stuff. So it was really interesting to watch kind of how she played across even the the, if you want to call it
typical lines of the
political.
conversation.
Yeah, it was really interesting stuff. So yeah, I don't know. I'd love to hear, any if there's any other sort of follow-up questions from those who are listening, you know what I mean, on that. But those were the thinking that was there.
Well, Carol says she I think she was talking to color out. Many times we say race, we think black and white, not white skin to white skin. And I think maybe getting to the fact that that when we think about racism, we get strong contrast of the two parties in question. And when it comes to white and say Jewish, there isn't that strong colorism there as much. It is a little bit, but it's colorism plus all these other things, blue eyes, and like it's kind of what you're saying. Race and what they were protecting was a little bit different than what even racism looked like in our time here in America.
Sure. It's evolved.
Yeah, so the rules around what that was a little bit different.
Yeah, because she even said, I think in one of her rebuttals, she said something about it was white people fighting other white people, right? Which again got her in a little bit of trouble because obviously it wasn't a battle. The Holocaust wasn't a battle. It wasn't a war. You know what I mean? It was a genocide. So it was a powerful structure in a government doing something to another marginalized group. So yeah, there was a lot of stuff that Whoopi got in trouble for. I guess the question is probably like, does the punishment fit the crime and all those good things. So sorry, go. What's this one, Adrian? Looking at here.
Well, I was kind of putting up some of the comments there, but Brian says, I find it interesting. The same people who would be outraged if a white woman said what Whoopi said are now justifying what she said and try to explain it away.
Yeah,
I think to that I would say there is the same amount for me. There's the same amount of grace. I'm about ideas, not about who says them. So whomever would have said whatever, I'm not ready to cancel Whoopi, and so there may be some other people who did feel like she should have been canceled. I don't think she said anything wrong, but I also don't think that she was particularly protecting anyone. I think that she was working out a critical thought, and so I'm not sure that I would. I'm not sure that I would feel differently if someone else said that. Although maybe I would. I would say this though. I will. After having said that, let me say this. You can expect that any sort of there's a certain grace that comes with people who are the products of trauma or the products of abuse. And so it would be reasonable to talk to a slave when slavery was a thing and for them to think all white people were terrible because all the white people they dealt with were terrible. And even though you might know differently from your point of view, you might listen to that point of view and say, hey, there's a certain empathy with contextualizing the conversation, who's saying it and why they might be saying that. And so what you're saying, what you're implying is that there's a double standard between people who are Black or people who are on one side of a conversation and another. And what I'm kind of coming to is, I don't know that it's a double standard as much as it's understanding context of conversation and comments. Sometimes what looks like a double standard is really grace, and others with people who are working through or responding to an abuse or trauma that they will have received. In the race conversation, Black people get to say a little bit more in these modern times because there's more trauma there. But if a white person were to come and say a similar thing, there's no trauma informing that comment, and therefore they don't get the grace from trauma afforded to them in that interpretation, and it's a little bit different. And I think it works the other way as well. The picture we've always said is, or I'm starting to say these days, is, you know, an abused dog is going to bite and scratch even with the person that's helping it. And we know that. And so we if we were to grab an abused dog and get bit, we wouldn't say this is a vicious dog. We would say this is an abused dog. And we would, that bite wouldn't mean that they're attacking me. That bite is a product of the trauma and abuse that it's experienced. And if we can do that with a dog, we can understand that there's behaviors that will show up as a result of being abused, that might feel like an attack, but it's really a hyper defensive mechanism. Then we can apply some similar kinds of gracious attitudes toward each other as we deal in this very urgent, passionate, and traumatic space of race. And that goes in both directions, with white, black, and otherwise.
Well, I appreciate. Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, I think it's important, just for the sake of conversation, that Antoine is not calling black people an animal, right? Like,
no, I'm not calling black people abused dogs.
That's how that.
Please don't email me.
That's so. You're utilizing an analogy that people can understand, and unfortunately, sometimes analogies need inanimate objects or objects that don't have quite the same value in humanity. So, are you going to switch us to something else, Adrienne, here?
Well, I just want to say, you know, Antoine opened with this idea that this is not a simple concept, and whatever Whoopi was trying to say got reduced to its simplest form. And, you know, we are, you know, in a time and place where nuance is required, where context does matter. And, you know, I think what we were discussing from the beginning is that the audience that, you know, did, you know, end up canceling Whoopi, you know, suspending Whoopi, whatever the reaction was, it was, you know, because whatever she was saying was being simplified. And I think that in this space, we should endeavor to hold context and nuance as fully as we can. And there isn't really anything at all that anyone says to us that we don't hear out of the voice box that it comes from. You know, the context of who says things impacts how that message is received. That's just true. That's just true about how communication works. So to say that if someone else said it, it would have been received differently is, you know, that's absolutely probable and absolutely understandable. So, you know, in the nature of simplifying things, we can do that as we receive information, like in this case, potentially with Whoopi. And then this can also happen as we pass on information. And this is something that the three of us were touching base on just before we went live, and the impact of how critical race theory is discussed. So I want to return to Carissa's question.
Well, hold up just a second. Just
absolutely.
I want to make sure we don't walk away from this completely, because I will get to this one, but I just want to comment on that. I'm in complete agreement in this aspect with what, in some ways, what Brian's saying is that when you have conversations around race and Black people say something that's incorrect, many times they are afforded the grace, which is ultimately coming from what you were talking about, Antoine, because there is this recognition of trauma and a history of trauma there, right? In this particular case, I don't agree with what you're talking about, Brian. I don't think a white woman would have actually been handled any differently in this space, because it was in our very sort of contextual current nature. The Jewish culture is considered white in many spaces. Like they wouldn't even think through it. Now, again, there's a lot of other things that are going on there, but they might have treated her the same way, because what would have happened is the same folks would have come out and said, hey, I know that you're white and you think Jewish people are white, but if I'm Jewish, I would say, but although we get roped into that, we have a much different history than that. And so I think they would have probably dealt with her the very same way. I think, and I think and also in some ways a correction, because one of the things you're saying is permanently canceled. What we see is there's plenty of white people who say terrible things about Black people, and they're not permanently canceled. They're just canceled for a time, or they find another place to go and do what they're saying. And I would also say it like this, is that I think particularly in this case, many times when people say something they may say something about a person, like if somebody uses the N word or whatever, they're talking about people here in a very negative, inferior standpoint. I think what Whoopi was doing was not necessarily going after a people group as much as kind of trying to articulate a scenario and maybe articulated that scenario insensitively and outside of the context of history. So I think that's where I would also engage that comment a little bit. So go ahead, take us away, Adrian.
And I'm glad we made time for that. Those were important. I'm just so grateful that Carissa posted this because it's something that so many of us that are trying to engage with our church leadership on building dialogue and space for racial reconciliation are encountering. She says that recently one of her pastors preached on racism and contrasted critical race theory to having a biblical worldview. Can you believe in critical race theory in union with a biblical worldview, or do they oppose one another?
Well, so the first thing I would say is, respectfully, the language of the question, especially with the word "believe in critical race theory," sets the conversation in a direction to say Christianity and critical race theory are in the same category. Critical race theory is a little bit like judging the Olympic ice skating, and there's a way that ice skating is supposed to go, and there's rules associated with that, and so you evaluate. Not all evaluations are the same. Christianity is a worldview that seeks to answer some of the biggest questions of our existence, of the who's, the whys, the whats of humanity. And then critical race theory is in that sense a magnifying glass in the school of Christianity, if you will, or the school of any particular worldview idea. So I think my first thing is to be careful to juxtapose Christianity with CRT as though it's either or, because they're not the same. They're not even in the same category. The second thing I would say to this is, the more I sit and think about some of the things built on critical race theory, the more I find there are quite a bit of compatibilities with, critical race theory teases out what the Bible tells us we might see in a sinful world where people are innately sinners. They are. Let me put it to you this way. If we start with society, we say, hey, power is a dynamic, power being influenced. Like, there's no power disparity in any society. Every society has to deal with people who have some level of influence more than others. If you can tell me a society where all the power disparity is, all the power is equal, then let me know. Right. But in any society, and I'm talking about any society, sure, including the family as a social unit, including some of your friend groups, there are it's almost 99% true that somebody wields a little more influence or power than someone else in any given social context. And if that's true, if that statement is true and power is inevitable, then you put on top of that creatures are sinners by nature, right? We are inherently sinners. We can't help but sin. We are addicted to ourselves and our self-interest, and therefore are likely to use whatever power and influence we have to serve our interests, most likely, even if it means it's at the expense of others, right? So if power and sin are two inevitable things that the Bible talks about, not CRT. The Bible tells us that power is a thing. Heaven power is a thing, right? The Bible tells us power is a thing. The Bible tells us that sin is a thing. Well, power plus sin equals oppression. So if we follow the Bible's formula, then we are likely to look at society in a sinful world and find some level of oppression in every society. That's a biblical worldview based on the sin of humanity, not on Karl Marx's view of whatever. Right? You don't need Karl Marx to understand oppression. Oppression inherently is a byproduct of sin and power. Okay, so now that you have that as your, if again, you haven't even hit the other things about CRT. Well, this concept of power and what we do with it is a part of the struggle of what Jesus was constantly dealing with over and over again, and understanding how CRT is bringing that power, oppression, sin conversation, and saying this is what it looks like in the race space, does create some levels of compatibility with the two. Are the two completely compatible? I would say no, because critical race theory is not trying to do anything religious or anything or addressing anything spiritual or salvific, and is not dealing with the spiritual man. It's dealing with a rule book of America, if you will, the American handbook, and trying to discover whether that handbook has really bad ideas in it. It's not dealing with the citizens of America per se. It's dealing with the handbook. And in that sense, it's got a very small scope. But I would say that there are some compatibilities. The problem with CRT is that it's been expanded to mean what it isn't. And when people say CRT, they don't mean what it is. They mean what they've created it to be, which is this really broad categorical statement that says that white people are the inherent and forever inevitable bad guy of every scenario, and that they must go, and that anyone who's not them should be given everything, and so forth and so on.
Yes, and to
And
clarify, that is not what CRT is, as
absolutely
Carol
not.
is kind of helping us, come back to that, this is a legal framework talking
Yeah,
about systemic injustice.
that's right.
And so, yes, Antoine is taking a moment to say there is the actual definition of CRT, and then there is what CRT has come to mean, which was what he was just saying. So I wanted to
Yeah,
take a moment for
and
that.
and maliciously and intentionally formulated to mean that. It didn't
Yes.
slip into that. It
Right.
was it
There
was
was
it was
intention,
it was it was intentional,
well
to
documented intention.
well
Mhm.
documented. Yeah, I can give you that. But so with that being the case, we're not having intellectually honest conversations about what CRT actually is. I'm one of those people that if I'm going to attack an idea, which I do think CRT has some ideas that can be attacked, let's just attack it head on for what it is and what it's actually trying to do, and not try to create it or make it out to be and say things that it's not trying to be and say,
Yeah.
or solve problems that it doesn't, that's outside of the scope of its work. And so a lot of the pastors, unfortunately, in sermons that I'm seeing, they're taking the modern version, the sort of the re the remix version of what CRT is,
Ah,
and they're preaching against that. Which, if that's what CRT was, I'd preach against that.
Yeah.
The problem is that that's not what CRT is, and that's when you get people who are like, wait, that's not exactly what that is.
Yeah,
right.
I think
And I
for
think
those of us that have been engaging on this for years, we had to learn what CRT was. We had never heard of it, coming from, background in implicit bias and, racial equity and inclusion training. This was a brand new term to me. It wasn't relevant even after years of exploring this from psychology and education and all these things. I wasn't until I was being accused of these things that I came to have any kind of reason to know what it was. So definitely so much to say about what it actually is and how it's being used. Sorry for
and and
interrupting. Go ahead,
and look,
Marcus.
and I think, and we'll get to Brian's thing in a second here, but
Yeah.
I think that what's important about what you said is people went to discover what it was, right? In the sense of they went to the source to discover what it is. Somebody created critical race theory. Again, it wasn't just dropped in. It was there was an intention, and it literally has an origin story. And in fact, yeah, I want to recommend if you there's a thing called Masterclass that's out there right now that you can subscribe to. It's kind of a paywall, subscription service. But in this masterclass, they have this 3 season documentary called Black Love, Black Freedom, Black History, and it's a great season. We're just talking about lots of different things. In the second season, towards the middle, they have the creator of critical race theory, Kimberly Crenshaw, the one who actually coined the term critical race theory, who gathered 35 different race lawyers and different kind of things in a space to actually like talk about how race and law kind of work together, following in the footsteps of Derek Bell, where they gathered. That person who did that, Kimberly Crenshaw, she is on there, and there's one called The Origins of Critical Race Theory. Now, here's the great part. Up until the 28th of February, you can watch this particular series, this Black Love, Black History, Black Freedom. You can watch this on Amazon Prime if you have it. So if you have Amazon Prime, just put in there Black History. I think it's called Black History, Black Love, Black Freedom, and it will come up. And you can look through. They've got Cornel West in there. They've got Sharon Eiffel on there, Angela Davis, Jelani Cobb, and these are the instructors. So Kimberly Crenshaw does a session on the origins of critical race theory in season 2. And I would just recommend, if you're sitting back and you're going, what is critical race theory? Like, or at least where did it come from? How, like, it's all there. She does I was about to say she does a great job of explaining this thing that she
it's
created.
her thing. Yeah. Or she's one of the originals.
Right. Like,
yeah.
and here's the reason why I tell it like this is I've heard many podcasts, I've heard many pastors who preach against critical race theory, but never actually quote anyone from the academic creation of critical race theory. If they're using any terminology, it's terminology that I hear in the critiquers of critical race theory, those who have determined that it's a worldview from the Christian standpoint. They have created this sort of, guise about this is what critical race theory is, and everybody's getting behind that. And now when your preacher starts to talk about it, you're going to hear them say critical race theory is blank, 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 but they won't quote anybody. And then they'll go, but the Bible says X, Y, Z, and then they'll quote the Bible, right? As if they're the same. And again, supports the idea from the Bible standpoint with quotes from the scriptures, but doesn't even support the ideas of what critical race theory is from its texts, not scriptures, but its texts on critical race theory. So that's the first thing I think people should recognize if they're hearing their pastor talk about it. If they're not quoting anything, then you need to be careful. They're probably just quoting, some other pastor or book that they've read on it, but not anybody from it.
Yeah.
So just to directly respond to Carissa's question, to clarify, she's wanting to know, can you agree with both the Bible and critical race theory? And if you're defining critical race theory as there is systemic legal injustice toward Black people, then it seems that it is possible to agree with both. What do you guys think?
And here's what I would say, even from
go ahead.
An origin story. And we did this at our conference last year. We had Rasul Berry in, and he was talking to one of the Derek Bell, who ultimately kind of inspired this work when he was at Harvard. And he taught classes around this. It wasn't called critical race theory. He was just talking about how does race affect law? And he was doing these classes. One of his last students is a friend of Rasul Berry, who was in our conference and who's on our show. And he's going to be on our show the 25th, or February 25th, live color commentary. And he talks about talking to the student, and this student he was talking to was not a Christian. And he asked the student, where did Derek Bell kind of get his ideas about this? And he said, Derek Bell, although I'm not a Christian, this is the student, I'm not a Christian, but Derek Bell believed in God and he believed in Jesus. And he was getting his ideas from the ideas of what Jesus talked about with equity and equality, right? And so all that to say, can it be transferred? Can it work with the Bible? Absolutely, because the guy who ultimately it's coming out of, he was reacting to what he saw ultimately, I think, in scripture, and it was making him ask these questions about and be critical about, if I see these disparities, it's either that God has made these people in a lesser image, or that sin is real, and when people who are sinners create a system, that their sin may slip into creating a system that disparages and creates disparities amongst other folks who they think of as inferior, right? So the likelihood of sin being the problem, sin of those who create the system, is more likely than this whole group of people is just inferior and incapable of doing certain things, right? Because everybody's made in the image of God. Everybody's got opportunity to kind of create. And there's lots of people who don't take that opportunity. That has nothing to do with their cultural background. So
yeah, there's a lot. I mean, we could say much more about this. I would say a statement. Systems are designed to produce an outcome. That's what the systems are designed to do, any system. And so we evaluate systems all the time. And the question is, does it produce the outcome it's supposed to produce? And critical race theory looks at a system and says, hey, is the American system creating the outcome that it said it wanted to create? And if it doesn't create that outcome, all of us adjust systems. So it doesn't even need to be moral. We could make it moral, but it doesn't need to be moral. We could just ask, what sort of society does America want to create? Okay, it wants to create something that's a free society, an opportunity society, whatever, right? That's what it's, because that's what the Constitution says it wants to create. Okay, so then we look at what society is, and you say, is the society has it created that? And then you say, well, not fully. Okay, well, what are the reasons why? And there's two locuses for where the problems might be. The problems might be in individuals, and not or, and the problem might be in the actual system itself. I'm gonna give this quick example, and then we can move off of this. If we were to go to a company, and we say, hey, we see this company, and it get brought to our attention that no women are promoted ever in this company, company A that we go into, right? We go and we say, wait a minute, what is up with that? That feels like a disparity. Now, it could be that women just are not good enough, right? And that could be part of it. And maybe they're just not good enough to be promoted. Or let's just look and see if there's something in here. Now, there's two places we can look for why women might not be promoted. We could survey all of the bosses and try to detect whether sexism exists in the bosses. And that would be a legitimate inquiry, right? But we could also ask to see the employee handbooks of that company. And we could say, is there anything in this employee handbook that would cause us to believe that this company does systemically, as a process and procedure, endorse the promotion of women? And if we were to get the handbook and flip through it and find that there's a line there that actually says, do not promote women, right? Then we would say, oh, we should if we don't want a company that doesn't do that, we should probably just erase this line and make sure that this handbook isn't producing the disparity of not promoting women. Now, does that line eliminate the fact that there's some dude somewhere who may be sitting there saying, hey, I don't want to promote women? Absolutely not. Now, this is what CRT is doing. CRT says, give me the handbooks. That's what CRT is talking about. It's not even asking about the employees at the moment. That's not to say that the issues aren't in the employees. It just means that CRT is not concerned. That's not its scope. It just wants to know, is there something in the handbook that promotes or is creating the disparity that is in question that we don't want? And that's it. That's all the CRT is. It's not an either or proposition. It doesn't mean that if it's in the handbook that it doesn't exist in the hearts of the bosses. It's probably a little bit of both, but the last thing you want is for everyone in the company to have a good heart about promoting women, but they can't promote those women because the system has a law in it that says women can't be promoted. So let's clear the system, and then we can deal with the individuals. And that's kind of where CRT is as a picture. Hopefully that's helpful in seeing that it's not about the persons, it's about a bad system.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I always love having you in here, Brian. You have the same song. It's the same song, new verse. There seems to be a trigger when anyone is talking about the idea of possible systemic racism. And I think one of the things that you were talking about, Antoine, is that's not to say that there aren't, and I know this, I want to be positive about what I'm going to say. But I've been doing the show for a little bit, and I've seen you roll through here a couple of times, Brian, and I think you're stuck someplace, bro. You're stuck in a spot. There's a consistency of this idea that Black people, and I'm saying it very generally, the way you write it in the quote there, that Black people are this and white people are this, right? So Black people always respond this way, white people always respond this way, or this always happens to Black people and never happens to white people, right? And so to the point of what we try to articulate is, there are nuances in the midst of the ways things happen around Black and white people, right? There are definitely Black people who are lazy, who don't have experience, who have a desire not to work and not to do anything. And the way that they got and where they've been in their situation is because they've chosen to engage that way. And I would say that that's true in every context. Now you and I have grown up in different places, Brian. I grew up in a predominantly white space, and what I've noticed is there's lots of white people who don't want to work and are lazy. And look, COVID taught us that, right? They'd love a check from the government. Let's just do it. Let's just not work, whatever. People love that. It's not just a particular place, right? Particular people. But what's interesting is if you were to take the same amount of folks in each one of the cultures, say white and black, and you were to say there's an exact same amount of percentage about people who want to work and people who don't want to work, you're still going to find this. You're going to find this disparity amongst the black community and the white community. Now, of course, we can say that, well, the disparity is because these people who are black just don't want to do anything. And that's part of it. There is a part, but there's a large segment of we can see historically in the black community of folks who work really hard, maybe harder than most, if I can say. And I mean, you could just go back to slavery and kind of talk about who works hard and who doesn't work hard. You could walk through segregation, you could talk to Jim Crow segregation, and just look at all the ways in which black people had to work multiple jobs to even get those certain things, and didn't have opportunity even to get jobs. It was legal. This is where critical race theory comes in. There were legal things that were keeping them from getting certain types of jobs. Housing markets, right? Being able to kind of get into housing in different areas, the segregation that we have. This was a legal thing. This is where critical race theory again comes in, looking at the laws that really determine where black people live and the opportunities that they have and the engagement that they have. Now, I'm saying all this not necessarily for you, Brian. I'm saying it actually for those who are listening, because I just engaging you recently, I don't think this is actually helping anything for you. But for those who are listening who are maybe thinking like Brian, you've got to continue to understand that you can't look at a particular situation and erase all the ways in which power, the people involved, the place that it's happening, the past, politics, have affected how people engage with one another, where they live, where they work, and how things happen amongst them. You can't erase all that. And so I think if we constantly are looking at the disparities, which critical race theory is examining, if you're looking at disparities and you're constantly find the same groups at the top, same groups at the bottom, again, you can easily go, well, it's just because black people don't want to do anything, which I'm not saying you're saying that, Brian, but I think the implication sometimes sounds like that, but I don't think that's what you're saying. I think you're more sophisticated than that. You can't have a whole group because obviously Antoine and I are here. So the idea that black people can't do anything, they don't want to do anything it can't be sustained and supported completely generally. But even if that was a case that there's black people who don't want to do anything, the thing that can be most managed, if you will, is this system that we all engage in. There is a system that has been created, and there's continual disparities that's going on. As a person on the outside of the communities, right? Because we could go in there and we could do a lot of stuff for black people and try to help them make better decisions if they are indeed the problem. But they get to make their own decisions, much like you mentioned in an earlier aspect of individual personal decisions. But there's a series of individual personal decisions that people make when they create laws as well. So people do make those individual personal decisions, and those create sometimes oppression. And in the midst of oppression, there are victims. I would say Adam and Eve they made some individual personal decisions that actually created a system in which sin created all of us as victims. All humanity has become a victim of Adam and Eve's personal decision to sin, the power that they wielded by that personal decision. And now all of us have to engage. So you mentioned that in an earlier one, Jesus wouldn't say we're all victims. Well, actually we are victims of the sin of Adam and Eve. And we make personal decisions to get out of those spaces. But there's also, how do you engage the system? You insert something new into that system. You reevaluate it. Jesus did an amazing job of evaluating the systems that were going on as far as the world was concerned about how to treat people. That's what the Beatitudes go into, right? The Beatitudes blow that up. Like, you have heard it said this, but I'm saying this to you. That's an affront on a system in which he goes and says, I'm correcting it. I'm evaluating it. I've looked at it, much like critical race theory, and I'm not connecting and saying critical race theory and Christianity is the same, but I'm just articulating the idea of evaluation of a system is not something unholy, separate from what Christianity is about. And I think that we can look at systems the same way and go, there's some personal behavior there, but there's also a system that needs to be looked at. So that's for everybody else.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we are going to take a short break kind of at our halftime show and just talk really briefly about our Threaded Collective. And I think that that's actually a really beautiful segue. I think that, all of us who are gathering here tonight are grappling with conversations that are happening around us and when and how to engage. Marcus was saying that, there are people that might be thinking some of these things and maybe they're not saying them. And we're going to
Mhm.
speak to that right now. And I would say there are also people that are thinking, did that just get said? And what do I say in
Yeah.
response? Is there anything I can say? And I just cannot speak enough to what the experience of being a part of the Threaded Collective has done for me in terms of having just a wonderful resource of people who have walked this road longer and have resources and answers to my questions. And I know that also, I think Antoine mentioned one of you were mentioning somebody from our
Sure.
conference last year. Okay, thanks, Marcus.
Sure.
And I wanted to also say that that is an amazing bonus when you join our Threaded Collectives, that you have access to the entire 2021 conference. Maybe we could blurb a few of those names, other people that were on that conference. It's like 30 hours of video or something like that
Yeah,
that you get
20
when you join.
it's 24 hours at least of video and wait a
Another
minute,
24 of
in
of
another I think 48. Yeah, but Rasul Berry is who Marcus mentioned, but we also have Sung Chin Rai in that mix, and as
Brian
well as
Laritz,
Brian Laritz and Mark
Sandra
Knoll and
Opsahl.
Sandra Van Opstal. Lots of really great thought leaders in this space. They really kind of help us, um, you know, help us with some of these topics that are really tough to sometimes think through, you know, um, fairly.
Yes. And so the Threaded Collective, like we said, is a monthly membership community that you can join at any point in time going to wearethreaded.org. And we would love to have you there. We put out a monthly webinar and always just keeping it fresh with what we feel like that we ourselves are walking through and struggling. Marcus was on our most recent webinar talking about culture. You want to tell us really briefly about what you just kind of like blur about what you did there?
Yeah, I did want to race and the gospel. I think it's kind of helping. It's part one of two that I think the second one maybe will be not this month, next month. But it's really engaging the conversation when people say we just need to preach the gospel. So those of you who are in that conversation, you hear people say, "Oh, you just need to preach the gospel." I really kind of walk us through an apologetic of race and culture from a biblical standpoint. Really, just engaging biblical text and kind of walking you through and go, "Here's some text that'll help you understand that race and culture and ethnicity are a huge part of what the gospel is really all about." And again, people are like, "Well, what's that?" So get to the collective, go listen to part one. Part one deals with really Old
I was
Testament.
about to say it was just part one.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So it's Old Testament, and then part two is where you'll get a lot, even more stuff from the New Testament section. So we'll
We
put that
try to
up.
make the new videos that happen once a month, 20 to 30 minutes. I was going to say 20 minutes, but I was the big, I was the breaker of the rule because my CRT conversation
Yeah,
went 30 minutes. But for the most part, we have another one coming up called this month, Cultural Humility by Amanda Giordano, and it's about 15 minutes, but it's great. It's a good 15 minutes. So we're saying webinar, but they're really accessible to listen to, and so and we try to produce one once a month for collective members. So it's the goal is not that you would we need to charge, because we all need to continue to be able to do what we do, but the goal is not to they're not priced in such a way that anyone's making any real buy yacht money buy a yacht kind of money. We're doing it so that we can continue to provide resources. We just know that this space is very difficult in a time that's very difficult, and we want to provide resources for people on a regular basis, and so that's why we're doing that. So we hopefully you guys can be a part of that and help us to continue to be able to make resources available for people like you.
Absolutely. It is one of the best investments I make every month. And, I just have found that to continue in this work, like there's never a point at which you kind of like you climb up that hill of adversity and then it kind of levels out. People are like, all right, well, she's not going to shut up about it. So we're going to, no, like it just keeps coming. There are new forms of being silenced. There's new language to learn. There is all of that, like, well, let's just stick to the gospel. I mean, that's a great way of silencing people who the Spirit has filled, and Scripture has, justified in pursuing this work. But even in the midst of that, it's a stunning accusation by your brothers and sisters in Christ that you are trying to lead anyone away from the gospel. And so you need people around you, and we would love to be those people for you. So go ahead and take a look at wearethreaded.org /collective. And we can jump back into our discussion now. We had a question submitted. And the question is, why do other ethnic groups seem to be doing just fine, but Black people still keep struggling? There's a lot to unpack there.
Well, there is a lot to unpack there. That's a deep breath. Let's get this out of the way. Some of it is personal responsibility, so that we can kill all the comments that are related to personal responsibility. Black
That's
people
not
have
gonna
made
kill all the comments.
some
I'm ready. Come on,
some
Brian. I
Black
know you
people
got it.
have made some really irresponsible choices, and that is the reason they are where they are, and we can accept that and acknowledge that. And no amount of systemic change will change their situation until they make better decisions. So that is a portion of the Black society. There is another portion of the society who are trying to navigate what it means to be a person of color in a space where they feel they have a significant handicap as to their abilities and the general underestimated nature of their character, their wisdom, their acumen. There are a group of Black people who struggle with the idea that they are the surprise success in other people's world. If you're a Black person and you show up, and sometimes it feels like White people are impressed by the fact that you have some level of skill or acumen. It's similar to what we might say when we have a son or a daughter who's like 7 years old and they're really great at drawing, but we didn't know quite how good they were. And they come up with some stunning picture, and it's still not like Picasso, but it's way more than you thought that they would come up with. And so you're like, not only are you like, this is good, it's like, wow, this is good. I can't believe you did this. And so there's a bunch of people that in Black community that we have to learn how to navigate that. And there's navigating that, and then there's trying to change that as a normal way of the normal way of things. And that's where we're in this conversation, where not only do we have to figure out the assimilation stuff, but we got to try to change the deal. Now, other nationalities or other ethnic groups don't have the same history as African Americans do. They don't have the same. They don't have much of the same traumatic responses and pain points that those other places have. And there's a few more options for assimilation for some of those other ones. We talked about it earlier today. Sometimes if you're light-skinned enough, you can just kind of fold in, and no one has to know that you're Hispanic. You could just pass. But as an African American person, you are African American, and that is what it is. So one of the things is just, there's a very significant I don't want to say special particular scenario for black persons in the American story, in American history, and that just makes it a little more difficult to say it summarily. I mean, we could get into a bunch of details, but we'd be here all night.
Yeah, but I think what I would say is there are some details in that I think that are important, probably as people are engaging. One is just in what I want to make sure people don't hear about what you just said is this idea that when Black people create or do something, there is a version of it that is not that we only think it's good because it's coming from Black people. There is some of that, right? And I would say there's some of that when you go across all the spaces, right? There's something about and I want to be very I'll be very stereotypical. When I see a white running back killing it, like old buddy on the Carolina Panthers who was hurt this year. I can't remember his name right now. There's a lot of folks who go, "Oh my gosh, like a white running back?" Like we just don't like that's like really successful. He was like listed as like one of the top running backs.
C-Mac? What?
You know, in the deal. So they just go because there's this cultural sort of stereotypes about who's supposed to be the running back. But that doesn't, although we say that, he's still really good and he shows it on the field, like he's killing it. I think there's Black people who have created art and engaged in academia that has been just as good, if not better, than white people. But it gets almost this stereotypical, like, oh, it's only good because they're Black, right? That's where that affirmative action kind of comes in. It's like, oh, the only reason you're here is because you're Black. No, that it can also be the case that they are really amazing, right? And here's what I would say is that you've seen come out of all kinds of communities things that people think are really amazing. Some of the only music that is actually American music, it comes out of the Black community. Gospel, jazz, blues, that's original American music that people love and people cover, and it came out of the Black community, right? So that's a side note that I want to make sure that people aren't hearing when you were saying, hey, it's only because of that. Like, it's just good. But some of from a technical standpoint, not all people migrate, but when they do, it tends to be the upper echelon of people who do migrate. So if you look at it like this, African Americans, right? This is different from Africans, but African Americans are kind of a whole new group of people that was created here in America. You brought all these people from Africa, you intermingled, they have new language, new things, all this stuff. It was created. They're the African diaspora for sure, but it was a whole new crew that was created here. So you have every single type of Black person here in America. You have the exceptional, right? The top 10, right? The talented 10th is what W.E. Boys would call it. And you got people who are not as talented that are all on the bottom. Now, every culture has that, right? White people, if you will, which brings in all kinds of different ethno stereotype or ethno groups into it. You have a range as well. When you look at the breakdown of opportunity and wealth gaps and all these kind of gaps that we talk about, these disparities that ultimately critical race theory is looking at and others are, you'll constantly find the same people at the very bottom. You know who those two groups are? I'll give you two guesses. All right, it's too late. Black people of slave descent and the indigenous. Interesting. The two very groups that had, some would argue, the most traumatic and horrible engagements in this country find themselves at the bottom of gaps, of opportunity gaps. Now, the Latinx, or I would call it Hispanic culture, is just a bit above the African American. So if you look at the wealth gap, studies have different numbers, right? But you'll see that let's call it African Americans are at 16,000 wealth. Latinx is 19,000 wealth. White Americans, 132,000 wealth. Now, what's interesting again is if you talk about Hispanics, it's much easier for people from Mexico, if you will, to migrate here on foot. They didn't have to cross any oceans, right? And there wasn't laws. Well, I wouldn't say it like that. I'll say it like this. There were incentives that were done when you start looking at particularly Asian culture, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, in the late 1960s, where they finally opened the door for Asians to come into America, right? Like they'd had a closed door like since the late 1800s. And when they invited them in, they specifically allowed for those who would bring things and value to America, doctors, lawyers, dentists, so on and so forth, that would bring a different kind of value to America and be able to help the capitalist system move what it needed to move. So you have all these folks who are coming in who were trained doctors and lawyers. So they come in with all the accoutrements of capitalism, and assimilation was so much easier because of that. If you go back to China, you're going to find a lot of people in China who are not doctors and lawyers. They're just not here because they can't migrate. They don't have the money, and they don't have the ingenuity, if you will, the exceptionalism to do it, and the means to do it. But you will find those who are at the bottom, those who either were here, the indigenous, those who were brought here against their will, and those who can migrate easily into the country. So you're seeing those kinds of things. So now, and also, I always am. It's always a dangerous game to play when you start pitting minorities against one another. I think
Mhm.
that's a tactic that people use to
Right.
take the spotlight off of maybe
Yes,
those who are at the top, not necessarily
very
just
much
white people,
so.
but elitism, right? Those who are really at the very top, because we've seen historically where upper class white folks uh, oppress lower income white folks as well, until black people or others move into the neighborhood. Then they create an alliance together, and it's a false alliance because the folks who are at the top are still just they're just
At the
getting
top.
right, and they just grabbed on to more people to help them push the others down. So all that to say is I would be careful. At first, you'd have to recognize that these things are happening when you're talking about different groups. And the other thing that's really difficult about it, and I'll say this really quickly, is the question is it's an interesting question. I think it should be evaluated. Um,
Yeah.
are you insinuating that there is something in the DNA of black people that relegates them to the bottom? If that is indeed what you're saying, then you are saying what has been taught to you in this country that has elevated white supremacy,
Mhm.
that has been taught to you in this country since its beginning, not only by from a government standpoint, but from a church standpoint too. And so you're high fiving a lot of people in history that I don't think you want to high five long term. It's an interesting question to ask, but I think it should be asked this way: why is it in a country that calls itself a Christian country that has Christian tenets and values that there are these folks that are constantly being marginalized? And why are there others who are constantly experiencing statutes of power, authority, and wealth? That would be a question I think it'd be a bit more.
Yeah, I think that um, there probably, it's unfortunate, we don't have a full panel of of diversity here, but I can almost guarantee that, if we did have someone from the Latinx community, if we had someone from the Native American community, they wouldn't necessarily say that they thought that, their ethnic group was doing just fine. And so
Sure.
I think that it's telling, the perspective here, why do other ethnic groups seem to be doing just fine? Who does it seem to whom does
Yep.
it seem like things are going just fine? I know, it is frequently drawn a comparison of Asian Americans to, particularly like African Americans, and the experience of being non-white, and why is it so
Mhm.
different for those two? And you hit the nail on the head. The circumstances under which they came here couldn't be more different, and that's completely relevant. But that being said, those same Asian brothers and sisters have also faced really difficult things over the course of the coronavirus,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
specific hate crimes as well. And we kicked things off talking about the Jewish community. So it probably is only as a member of the white community that it would seem that any ethnic group is doing just fine right now.
Yeah, I think that's a great correction and point on that is, particularly if you read a lot of literature by Asian Americans right now, they're going to give you so many other things in the midst of that. I mean, there's a whole community, the Hmong community, which is another part of the Asian American. Again, it's hard to say I'm Asian American because it's so general. It's such a big group, right?
Right.
That is also in the Asian community is a very low, marginalized, low income section of that community. There's actually a book that it's not a Christian book, so don't if you read it with a rake. But it's called Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong. That really talks to some of this stuff about the model minority conversation. That's very helpful, particularly right now as we kind of come out of the coronavirus and where we saw this 400% jump in Asian hate. And lots of protests and things of that nature as well. So, and then when you get into, we just did a podcast on immigration with colored commentary, and you get into
Should be
talking about
released
immigration
next week
and
or
some of
so.
the
Yeah.
policies and the ways that that works to kind of relegate people into a space is all there too. So it's a great articulation, Adrian, just to remember that there's a lot of stuff going on with that.
Well, I want to make sure that we touch on Black History Month. And I'm going to let you guys do it as kind of, what do they say? It's like a rapid fire round. What do they say? What is
Yeah,
that
lightning
phrase?
round.
Lightning round. Okay, lightning
Yeah.
round with this question. And then we will kind of close out with another great point that Carissa was making in regards to what it means to reconcile.
Great.
So, your lightning round is this. Are things like Black History Month and like companies featuring images of people of color just a superficial fix? Do you think it's a way for corporations and institutions to check off the diversity box, or is it actually changing something? So that's your lightning round. And 2 minutes or less. Give us your take on what is Black History Month doing?
The value of Black History Month. I think Black History Month is that for many a check, a marketing means to an end, if you will. Protect yourself from losing customers. I think that's a part of that. I also think that certainly for my history and growing up in school, Black History Month had a profound impact on my understanding of myself in my context, and really grounded my self-worth, and put my skin color in its proper place as it pertained to how I perceive myself. And without it, I think I would be a little less adjusted in where it comes to race. And so I think there's tremendous value there. I'm not sure how much value it is on the marketplace, if I'm honest with you. I think maybe socially, but I think in the classroom, I think when done well, it has significant value.
Yeah, and I think that definitely there is a value in the marketplace. I think people are looking at that kind of stuff. Like, are you celebrating Black History Month? Are you giving your employees off different holidays, whether they be, Dr. King holidays, or even, Rosh Hashanah, or any of those other things that are out there that people are engaging in. And I see more companies starting to deal with heritage months that are all coming through, whether it's Latin Heritage Month or it's Asian Heritage Month. They're doing all of those things. So what I would say is the presence of Black history has made people have to think about those other histories as well, which is very, very kind of par for the course in the way in which African Americans have kind of been the mouthpiece for some of these changes. But I also, again, we started this month out and with, I think, 10 HBCUs that were having bomb threats, right? So
14.
14. It kept going, right? Like, so is it changing? I think with the where we are right now, I think some people are considering it an affront, right? You have people, and look, we've seen them on even the chat, right? That just are frustrated at Black people. And they think that the existence of Black people, and when Black people are telling their truth about what's going on in the communities and going on amongst what's potentially happening, they get upset, and they think that white people are being accosted. They're becoming the villain. They're becoming the target. And so Black History Month reminds them of that, or makes them continue to think that. And so it creates a lot of frustration at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Well said. It's a both and, as so many of these things are.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Carissa is just giving us just hard-hitting questions. You can tell that she is in the midst of this good hard work, and we're so glad you're here. And Carol, your questions to Tony, all of you guys, Brian, it's been so good to have this discourse with you guys tonight. But we're gonna wrap up with Carissa's question about reconciliation here. She says she believes that God calls us to reconcile with anyone we can who has sinned against us, in as much as it is in our power. But she's struggling with the context of racism and any sin, where how is it that that reconciliation can occur if the sin or behavior is not actually acknowledged by the person who committed it? So one way reconciliation, what do you guys think? Does it take two? Does it take two parties?
Well, I mean, I think if we go to the scriptures for it, like, reconciliation is a two-way street. I mean, Jesus offers forgiveness. I always say he's got a smorgasbord. He's got a feast of forgiveness waiting, and Jesus has no issues with you, right? He died for you, so he lays it out there. It becomes us going, I want to take part in this feast that makes the reconciliation with Christ possible. And so I think it's only clear that it's the same, in human beings. You can definitely forgive people. You can confess to yourself and even confess to another that doesn't forgive you, and you can play those pieces. But you got to have two, I think, for full reconciliation to happen.
I would agree with that. I think there's two ways to look at reconciliation. One is the relational sense, but we talked about this in a podcast a while ago. I believe it was a podcast when you use the term reconciliation with your account, right? You say, I'm going to reconcile my bank account with my checkbook. What you're looking for is places where things have gone wrong, where you might have your balance sheet might say that you have $10,000 in it, but then your bank account actually only has 9,000, and so you need to reconcile them, right? You need to figure out what went wrong so that the two things are what they are supposed to be. And so
Mhm.
there's a reconciliation. We're called to reconciliation to each other relationally, in a sense, to fix the relational wrong, if you will, to balance the ledgers, to get the black, get the red out. Is it red? It's the red,
Yeah,
Gotta
right?
the
get
You
the
don't
red
want
out.
the
You want to
red in
get
your ledger, right?
Mhm.
So to get the red out of your
Black
ledger,
it up.
right, and you want to make it, you want to make that right. But there's this other reconciliation is just about putting things right, getting things right, and it keeps reminding us of what justice is. And the pursuit of justice is to take the wrong things out, the things that are unjust, and to put things where they're supposed to be, and promote those things which are supposed to be. I think the scripture is calling us to both types of reconciliation. One is to look at our neighbor and say, and rather, look at our neighbor and say, what is wrong about our relationship? My father did this thing to your father, and therefore our families have a rift with each other. Let's fix it. I didn't do it to you, but my father did it to your people. And as a result of that, our people now hate each other. We can fix that. Let's fix that.
Mhm.
That's a
Mhm.
reconciliation. It doesn't require doesn't require forgiveness or it might, but it's really just a committal to making what's wrong right. And
Mhm.
I think what Jesus did for us is there's something about sin. Sin took us away and made what he created incorrect, and he reconciles us to, he makes us right with him. He
Mhm.
justifies us. He cleans us. He makes it, he restores us, redeems us. All these terms have to do with taking something that was and making it right again. And the end of the day, the commitment to reconciliation is about making things right.
Mhm.
And what we're called to do is to make things right. Sure. And I'm one of the main ones that'll talk about forgiveness and commitment, forgiveness and confession
Confession.
and repentance. And I think those are fine relationally, but they are only in service to the broader context of reconciliation,
Mhm.
which is to take something that has been wrong and to undo it,
Mhm.
or to make it right again. And so we have the job to work toward making things right, especially among the brethren, especially inside the church. And I
Mhm.
think that we should pursue that at all costs.
Yeah, and
Mhm.
if I can drop a scriptural, connection to that, there's a story in the Bible that I think some days I want to say it's been intentionally sort of youth, uh, 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 made into a child story. The story of Zacchaeus. Uh, I think we spend the most time, and I remember getting into an argument with a preacher at one point. He wanted to talk about the idea of Zacchaeus feeling insecure because he was short, and I was like, this story is not about him being short. That's the children's version of that. The story is about reconciliation and restoration.
Mhm.
There's a point in which Jesus says, "I'm coming to your house," right? And what Zacchaeus shows us in that moment is he says, if understanding what he understands about Christ, if Christ is going to be in my house, I got to get some stuff right.
Yeah.
Right. I got to get some stuff right. And what does he immediately do? He goes to Christ didn't say anything about this. He goes to, I have cheated people and I need to make that right. And not only am I going to make that right, I'm actually going to pay a little bit more because of the ways in which the opportunity cost that these people lost based on the things I did to them. And then what does Jesus say? Salvation has come to this house, right? Like that's what it is. So I think that's the reconciliation he knew he needed to make that with Christ. He had to reconcile with his brother, he had to reconcile with humanity, other humans, before he felt that he could even be in a good reconciled
Mm,
relationship with Christ. And
that's
so
beautiful.
I think that's a really powerful thing for us to see as far as what reconciliation. There's more out there that we can get in that's not just a personal, but that's communal. But I think that's a great story for understanding what reconciliation looks like based on all the things that Antoine was talking about.
Yes. And yeah, Christ is our ultimate example of reconciliation. He has provided this pathway for us to be reconciled, and He remains there in the path waiting for us. And yes, can we be reconciled? Like, or I should say, no. Can we be reconciled if we don't walk into that reconciliation? This is exactly to Chris's point. No, it does take two. But like Christ, to move toward reconciliation, to have reconciliation be the journey, the forward movement, the verb. we can't ensure with another human that we will be reconciled. We can't ensure that because it requires two parties, but we can always ensure that we are in the posture to be reconciled with them. And that is something that I've gotten really from this group, from Antoine, just saying, Rick, remain in that middle place, remain in the aisle, two hands outstretched. That's what it looks like to be doing this work of reconciliation. Any final words from you guys?
Come back next month, man. We love the interchange. If you haven't if you haven't subscribed to the YouTube channel, do so. One, because you'll be aware of these things, but two, we are still trying to get to that 100 so that we can be youtube.com/threaded or whatever, and we can't name our page until we get 100 likes or
subscribers, right?
I think so we're at like 60 or something.
Oh no,
like
we're up
that.
to 73. So
73.
Oh.
We're up to 73. So we only have a little bit more. So if you're interested in sort of being a part of that and telling other people about this sort of very unscripted conversation that we're having once a month, then yeah, do that and like the channel. But I enjoy all of the things, the challenges and the questions, and I live for this. I love idea share, so this is great for me.
Yeah, I agree. I enjoy the time coming in. To Antoine's point, come back next month. If you haven't been listening to Color Commentary, check it out. We've got got a live show coming up on the 25th. I think it's 11:30 to 1. It's your lunchtime brunch, your lunch brunch. Come check it out. I think we will have Rasul Berry on there. We're going to talk about Black History Month, talk about some of our favorite characters. That's probably not the right way to say it, but our favorite figures in the Black community. Celebrate that, and then again, talk questions and answers. So it'll be another deal where Antoine and I, from a Color Commentary standpoint, are going to be doing the same thing. So glad to be here. And Adrian, thank you so much. As
I was
always,
going to say, Adrian, thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you.
Yes.
Thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening.